Well, actually, I figured it'd be less than 5, so I'm actually thrilled that there's a couple of people in here. Hello, Leon. Welcome. Anyway, if you sat in the earlier sessions, you heard all about hydrogen and ammonia and green and gray and blue. You're not hearing it, so this is just old-fashioned tank stuff. So if that's not what you came for, you can leave and go see some more exhibitors. So is there anybody here that does not know what API 2350 is? Sounds like, oh, wow. Either you're asleep or you know what 2350 is. All right. So, and I will warn you up front, this will be the most different presentation probably of the conference and the least technical. But for some reason, Margaret lets me come back and talk anyway. So anyway, it's just a bunch of mumbo jumbo. The one thing I do want to point out on here, I have my first U.S. patent. That's post-Kinder Morgan. So that's an actual license. So if you want to talk to me about it, in other words, I have the world's only truly independent tank alarm. That's the only sales pitch you get. So those are my logos. I think they're funny. I have cards that have those on there. So is there anybody, besides Margaret can't count because she's put up with this stuff. Is there anybody in this room that's seen me present before? So what's next? Kids photos. Okay, you're right. So I did shorten them because every time I come to Europe, I get told there's too many. I will admit the first time I went to Antwerp, I put a few in. When I came back here a couple years later, I doubled it but I was trying to be nice. So anyway, my first granddaughter, there you go, Kennedy Rochelle. She, as of this weekend, she's a junior. She's my theater geek. My first grandson, he's a sophomore as of this weekend. The baby of the bunch, oops, I'm back up. Bailey Marie, she'll be a freshman cheerleader this year. So, and I'd love to point this out, this dress picture over here. That's not like Disney or something. That's like going out to eat on Saturday night. That's kind of so. And then the other one, my son's daughter, Heidi Sage. She's all around the world. And then I was fortunate to be blessed with a bonus granddaughter. So Haley, she's my softball player. She's a senior as of this weekend. So. And last but not least, the baby of the bunch, Toby Earl. So he's kind of a hoot. So anyway. And then pictures. Come on. There you go. So I do this more of a retro because it reminds me how old I'm getting because they're all growing up. So anyway. And I normally have a spiel in there. I cut it down, but there's one brief picture of my wife in there. The only reason I don't have my wife in there is not because I know it, but she doesn't want her picture up here. So that's, anyway, back to the program. All right, everybody familiar with API? I've had the pleasure of sitting on various API committees. I'm in my 29th year on SCAS, which writes 650, 653, 651, 652, 654, 655, 650, Anyway, typically these things are updated every 5 to 7 years. That is actually in the API and their ANSI standards, so you have to do that. Now, you either have to withdraw them. If they're a perfect standard, you can just republish them. And typically, you change them. Most API standards, they print them, and then they kind of go to sleep for about 3 years. And then they'll get some people on a committee, and then they'll make changes for a couple of years, and then they reprint it. The tank standards for like API 650, 653, and 620, we actually work on those twice a year. So those change almost every year. They're very dynamic. That's kind of the business. API, by the way, has one of the greatest business models of all time. You pay to go to their meetings. You do all the work for free, and then they sell you what you write. So one of the ones is API 2350, which tells you how not to overfill. It's in its 5th edition. The 5th edition was published September of 2020. Right in the middle of COVID. It was late because the previous edition, 4th edition, was published in 2012, but it took a little time to get there. I've been on the committee since the 2nd edition, so and I got to co-chair the last one. So right now in the U.S., and I realize that I'm not in the U.S., but a lot of companies will reference an API standard in their company policy. It says we'll follow, whatever the standard is. In the U.S., some regulators will say you will follow API, and some will say you will follow API 653, third edition, third addendum, published 2005 kind of thing. So it really depends. And what I point out to owners, and I used to point out to my former employer, is you got to be careful what you say, because if you put it in your internal documents that you're going to follow this stuff, and something happens and you don't follow this stuff, the lawyers like to have a little chat with you. So the presentation is available except without all the cute pictures. I left this in there. So just kind of going back, it was one in 05, 2012, 2020. Used to be an RP, a recommended practice. People outside of API thinks there's a difference. There is no difference from a legal standpoint of an RP or a standard. The difference in an RP and a standard is a standard has to have things that you can say you shall do this. An RP just says kind of we suggest you think about doing this, or you should consider this, whatever. But a standard has to have demonstrable things that says you can say you comply or not. And so in 2012, we changed it to a standard, and now it is a standard. It went from 40 to 58 to now 75, and it's got 8 annexes in it. So just so happens the 5th edition uses the word shall 195 times. What does that mean? Well, there's a whole bunch of things. But if a company adopts it and says we're going to follow this, that means there's 195 things in there you have to do to be fully in compliant. And in the U.S., it's already been adopted by the federal government, Department of Transportation for pipelines, and EPA references it. And the largest oil-producing state in the nation, Texas, where I currently live, has also adopted it into state law as of last year. Which means for an owner, if you've got tanks, it's a whole bunch of things you got to kind of check the boxes are. So there was nothing magic about 195. In the U.S., the regulation for pipelines is DOT 195, and people accuse me of manipulating the number to make it match. Actually, the word shell's in there 199 times, but 4 of those are definitions of what the word shell means. But there are actually 195 statements. So kind of covered that. So major changes. 2350 now allows wireless systems. So I don't want to embarrass anybody, but several of the vendors who have booths out here have participants on 2350. And if you go back to 2012 when we wrote the last edition, as an owner, I wanted the option to use wireless. But at the time, there were 7 vendors on the committee, and in 2010 timeframe, only one of them sold a wireless system. So the other 6 said, no, we're not going to allow wireless. It was not a technical reason. It wasn't, they didn't want to. So fast forward to about 2017, we start writing again. Guess what? Everybody sells wireless now. So the advantage for an owner is you do not have to run conduit and cable up the side of your tank to put an alarm in or a gauge. So that is if you have an existing infrastructure and you're already there, doesn't matter. If you're trying to upgrade your facilities, or you buy a facility, or you change products and you want to add a bunch of alarms, it's much easier to add wireless than it is to run a whole lot of conduit and cable. So that's an option. Doesn't mean you have to, but so kind of covered. The biggest change is when you go back to the 3rd edition, there was the industry doesn't necessarily use the same words from company to company. So the normal level you put your tank, a lot of people call that safe fill, normal fill, whatever. So 2350 tried to standardize language and definitions. So the term that 2350 uses is maximum working level. That's how much you can put in a tank on a normal basis. And then, of course, there's above that. And the thing that I find kind of interesting is you have to have a high on your tank, but you don't have to have a high, which I always thought was ridiculous. But most people do have a high on their tank, but it's not required. And the real issue is how full can you get it before something bad happens? 2350 was originally part of the fire code system for API. And it was only for gas tanks, and it was only for pipeline and marine transportation. And the reason for that, if you put too much gas in the tank and it comes out the side, you're probably going to have a fire, if it's any significance. A little incident happened in UK about 17 years ago called Buncefield, and there have been a whole bunch of others. So the terminology got changed, but then in the way the world has changed, obviously nobody wants to have a fire, but you also don't want to just spill product on the ground anymore. That's a problem for most people, both from an operator standpoint and from a legal jurisdiction standpoint. So we created a new term called critical high. And critical high is the point when if you put that much in the tank, bad things are starting to happen. It could be product coming out the side. It could be you're running your floating roof into your cone roof or your aluminum roof. It could be you push your seals past your vents, which is a air violation, it's a safety violation, and you're tearing up your equipment, So we explain what it does. In the 4th edition, we came up with what we call a category system, and it used to be based on attendance. How many people, did you have full-time people at your site, or part-time people, or no people at your site? It really doesn't matter. What we went to now is how much equipment you have in your tank. Do you have a gauge on your tank? Do you have an independent alarm on your tank? So a lot of people liked the category system because it made it very easy to say these tanks over here are similar and these are different. Not everybody liked it. So what the new edition says, and this is what's going to catch a lot of owner-operators by surprise, I think, if they haven't been paying attention, is you have to do a risk assessment on every individual tank that you own and operate, or that you operate, because you may not own them. And until you do, you have to follow the category system. And essentially what the category system says, if you have no gauge in your tank, you have to leave an hour at the top of it as a safety factor. If you have a local gauge, it's 45 minutes. If you have a gauge that goes back to a control room, it's 30 minutes. And if you have a gauge and an independent alarm, you can go to 15. Once you do your risk assessment, you can take it to 20 seconds if you want. But you have to do a documented risk assessment. And there's a whole long list of items, like if you change the flow into the tank, you change the product in the tank, you have to reassess those risk assessments. And the purpose is not to tell other people how to run their assets, it's just all the things they need to think about. And it's also been expanded, it's not just gasoline, it's any product now, and it's really a function of how fast you're going into a tank. You used to have an exception for wheeled vehicles. So if you're unloading from a truck or rail cars, those didn't count. We took that away because there's been so many unit train facilities built, and some of those unit train facilities flow at 10,000 barrels an hour. And that's much faster than a lot of pipelines flow. So it's really not, it doesn't matter how it's getting there, it's how fast are you putting into the tank. Because the faster you fill the tank, the more likely you're going to have an accident. So the risk assessment part is going to be a big deal. I copied and pasted this out there. API is very funny about trade right and everything, but so this is educational, so I quote it, I say exactly, so this is, if you don't have a copy of it, but that's what it is. So, and they don't tell you how to do your risk assessment because every major company, and even most small, they have some form. Most people have some kind of, 3x3, 5x5 matrix, consequences, probability, lots of color codes, lots of numbers. There's quantitative, there's qualitative, there's semi-qualitative. We stay out of that. We mention all that, just say in case you don't know what's going on. So, like I said, it says you will do a risk assessment. And until you do that risk assessment, you have to follow the category system. So, and there's a whole bunch in the back, annexes that tell people how, there's a bunch of examples to make sure you understand how I cannot tell you how many times I've come across a tank overfill or a problem with a tank. It's mostly because people don't understand how tanks are built and designed. Do you measure are you measuring the bottom up? You measure from the top down? Is it a flat bottom? Is it cone up, cone down? Where's the datum plate? Can you do geometry on the roof if it's got a cone roof? And quite often the answer is no. You have to start with the critical high, and then the high, and the working level. And then this stands for levels of concern. In other words, where are you worried about it? Every company is a little different. Some companies are much more conservative. Some companies maybe want to push the envelope. That's okay. They don't tell you how to do a risk assessment. They just point out that you have to do one. And then there's also one here, like I said, Annex E talks about qualitative, semi-quantitative, and risk screening. So I've been doing this for over 20 years, and was the chair. I just, last week was actually the tank meetings in Chicago for the API, and API informed me I was going to chair it again for the 6th edition, which even though we just published this a year and a half ago, they're already starting to talk about it. So I guess I get to do this at least one more time. So I was kind of, and API documents are consensus. That means you get a whole bunch of people in a room and you kind of all argue and yell and scream and try to be a diplomat maybe and tell. There's a little bit of horse trading going on, or I'm not sure if it translates well, but it's not necessarily the most technical argument. Sometimes it's just, there's actually a 3-inch level in here, minimum space. That 3 inches came because the company I came for had a 2-inch one, and some people wanted 6 and 4, and after about 2 weeks of arguing, we settled on 3. There is no science. There's no science. There's no data. Just telling you. So no matter how many times you review it, you think it makes sense, but then somebody else reads it. Especially, we write these in English. They get translated. Other people, English is not their first language, so maybe they read it a little differently. So we're constantly people going, did you mean this or did you mean that? In the previous edition, they had a phrase in it called human factors analysis. Does anybody know what human factors analysis is? Can you explain it? Because nobody in API can explain it. So we changed that, make it a little more sensible. It says if you have response time less than 10 minutes, you have to prove it. You have to do a field verification. So if you say you can shut your, exactly. If you think you can shut down in 4 minutes, that's fine, but you have to prove it. And that's part of your whole assessment. So anyway, I didn't change this after I sent it in, so but I will be participating again because I literally found that out yesterday. So anyway, and with that, short and sweet, not less. It's a good document. It points you in a lot of direction. If you're an owner-operator, there's a lot of things you should consider. If you're a vendor, supplier, or a consultant, there's probably going to be a lot of work coming out of it because when the first time somebody has an overfill or a fire or worse from not following it, there's going to be a lot of ramifications. And this is used, by the way, by a lot of international insurance companies. They use this kind of stuff to come into facilities and go, are you following this? Are you following this? So since I talked relatively fast, I'll tell you a real quick story. About 10 years ago, I was running the largest liquid assets in North America for Kinder Morgan. I was the general manager, and a guy from Hartford Steam Boiler came in to do a risk assessment. The guy walks in, and I'm trying to have him coffee set up, and I'm trying to be real nice, and he's like, no, we're not doing this. He said, I went out on the internet and I found an industry expert who says how to set your levels, and that's what we're going to follow. And he pulled out the PowerPoint, sat it on the table, and I saw my name. And I went, not only is that guy a genius, but he's damn good looking too. And the guy looked, and Crochet is not exactly a common name, at least not in the U.S., but he had not associated it. And he went, I said, no, you said it. I fully agree. And he was, he kind of dug himself a pretty good hole there. So I had a lot of fun with that. So anyway, seriously, any questions? 2350 API. Want to know what a tank whisper is? So I want to leave plenty of time for the last panel. So no questions? well, either I put you to sleep or I did a really good job. So anyway, I'm around. If you have any questions, oh, I have one. Whee.
Seems like you needed a question, so I can ask it. It seems that IPI 2350 is more and more harmonized with the IEC 61511. Yeah, is that going to be in the next edition also? So you are going more and more to the risk assessment and follow that standard?
Yeah, the what is it, 615? Yeah, 511. There was a lot of influence on that. The challenge is technically API is a one company, one vote. So like myself, my single person company, I get one vote. Exxon gets one vote. But not all the majors agree, and so there's still some pushbacks. The people who make a lot of the equipment, like your company, and others are the kind of the technical experts. Personal point, almost 30 years ago when I started doing this, all the technical expertise was with the owner companies, the Exxons, Chevrons, Shells, BP, da-da-da. Very little technical expertise is in the owner companies anymore. It's mostly in consultants or manufacturers. In fact, it used to be API policy that you had to be an owner to run a committee. They dropped that about 15 years ago because they couldn't find enough owners to run committees. They quietly dropped it. So I always preach to owner operators, if you're not involved in doing this stuff, somebody's going to do it for you. And if you're an equipment manufacturer, device manufacturer, some of those have field experience, and some design it in an office somewhere. And if you need both. So,
25 years in the chemical industry, of that manufacturer,
yeah, no, it is. So thank you. Yeah, I had a question. All right, we good? Thank y'all.